Discrimination, whether it's fair or unfair, or just or unjust, it should not be based on if you're offended or if your feelings are hurt. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Tumblin, and we're going to talk discrimination today. So it's going to be a touchy subject, so I'm going to tread lightly here, but I'm going to tell the truth as always. So, discrimination. We talk about it in a negative way pretty much all the time, right? And for good reason. You know, there's really good reason for that, which I'll describe here in a second. But is it all bad? Is discrimination all inherently bad? Or is there some good in it? And before you get triggered and before you freak out, just follow me for a little bit here. Let's start with the definition of discrimination. Now, I looked at a couple definitions here, and I want to explain this a little bit. So the first one I looked at was from Oxford Dictionary, which says that discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the grounds of race, age, or sex. That's pretty much the definition that we all think, that we all consider when we think of discrimination. However, the term there, unjust, it actually adds some complexity. It adds some complexity. There we go, struggling through that one. Because isn't that rather subjective? And I know what you're going to say. Yes, we have laws and we have law and order in place. But the fact that it's unjust, I mean, that's a rather open-ended term. And I'm going to explain why that word really shouldn't be in that definition. So an example of this for being unjust is, well, you know, if you look at enforcing African Americans to drink from a different water cooler, that's certainly unjust. And I think we can all agree with that. You know, we do have definitions of what is unjust that we all tend to agree on. And we generally accept it as a society that certain things are deemed just and unjust, but it's not always clear. I mean, racist, basically, in America way back in the day, that of course it was wrong, and of course that was unjust discrimination. But that's a very, very clear example. So let's go over maybe a more broader definition. And before you think or say that I'm making this up, I am not. This actually comes from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, okay, which they define it as the act, practice, or an instant of discriminating categorically rather than individually. And so what that means is that it's pretty much the same definition as the one above. The only difference is that it doesn't imply that it's unjust, okay? So what it means is that discrimination means that you treat someone differently based on the category that they're in. You know, people are in different categories. Race, age, and sex are one of them. But needless to say, it's not necessarily the unjust treatment. Okay, so that's Merriam-Webster's dictionary. If we were to expand, maybe broaden up Oxford Dictionary just a little bit, it would be something more like different treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the grounds of race, age, or sex. Okay, so basically the difference is that discrimination, it doesn't necessarily have to be unjust. Okay, and if you look at the history of the word, it actually rings true. If you look at the history of discrimination, the history of the word discrimination, today it has morphed into something that's unfair and desirable, but the root of the word itself is actually neutral. It has a neutral history, and it comes from the Latin verb discriminare, okay, itself from another verb which is discriminare. Anyways, it's all Latin, but it basically means the root of the word discriminate. It comes from the word that means to distinguish between. Okay, so it's categorizing. It's not necessarily good or bad. It's a neutral term. Discrimination is a neutral term. Now, what we talk about today is pretty much only unjust discrimination. But I want to make it clear that if you do a bit of research on this, it's actually not true. Yes, unjust discrimination that exists and that is real. However, the word discrimination doesn't necessarily mean that the act of categorizing is unjust. Okay, and I'm going to explain how it can be just in many ways, or rather neutral, and so I'll get to that here in a second. But let's talk a little bit about like how society and our laws determine what is just and unjust. And as I mentioned earlier, we sort of decided as a society what is, well, just and unjust, what we think people should be able to do and what we think people should not be able to do. Okay, and it's typically based on like morals and ethics, and there's a whole philosophy section on that. There's a lot of studies dedicated just to morals and ethics, and pretty much every profession you do, there's certainly some learning based around morals and ethics. But generally, you can also see that as grounded in science, okay? And I'll explain that a little bit here in a second. But also personal freedom. I mean, personal freedom is a huge factor in terms of how our laws and society define what is just and unjust. Meaning something might be unjust, but because it's fundamentally a human right, we can't actually take it away. And an example of that is free speech. Like, is it unjust or unfair for someone to say racial slurs? Well, yes, of course. But what's even worse is taking away freedom of speech. And so freedom of speech it's a personal freedom that every human should have. And so even though it's unjust, we don't make it illegal. Even though, I mean, and it is, of course, it is discrimination, that particular example. But to get back on the science thing, and I mentioned that, like, it should be grounded in science, meaning what is just and unjust. And an example of this is that, it's a fact that if you're an African American descent, genetically over a certain threshold, because obviously you don't have to be 100% African American, you can be 50% Caucasian or whatever. But if you are genetically over a certain threshold, then you have a darker complexion. Okay, and no one would disagree with that. No one would argue with that. That's rooted in scientific fact. There's the skin pigment is different if you're of African descent. Just to be clear, I believe it's the pigment is the same itself. However, it's the quantity that gives the dark complexion. But all that example, all to say that if something is rooted in scientific fact, it's not necessary. Like, we wouldn't say that it's unjust, right? Even though technically that is discrimination, not in a bad sense, but it is discrimination because you are making a statement about a specific group of people. So you're categorizing a whole group of people based on something, and that particular case, it's factual. They have a darker complexion, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, of course. But we wouldn't say that that's unjust discrimination. Okay, it's generally accepted as being a fair statement. I mean, it's factually true. Just as I'm Caucasian descent, and I have I don't know what I have. I guess white skin or pale skin, pink skin. I don't know. We change colors throughout the year based on how much sun we get. But basically that's the point I'm trying to make. Is if it's grounded in science, we generally accept it. However, here's an interesting one, and one that probably gets a lot of publicity when it actually happens today, is if you don't select an African American for a particular job because they are African American, that is unjust discrimination. And the reason it's unjust is because, well, there's no evidence that they can't do the job just as good as anyone else. I mean, they're just as smart, they have the same size of brains, they have just as much physical capability. Like, it's from a genetic perspective, we're so similar that for, well, pretty much every job. I mean, there's no science that says that different races can do certain jobs better, and certainly some races, like, for example, that come to America, I mean, they do different in school, which is a result of their culture. For example, like a lot of students from Asia that come over to the States and to Canada, they tend to do really well because of their culture, but it's not a genetic thing necessarily. It's not necessarily a genetic thing. So we would say that, okay, there's no scientific grounds to say that they can't do the job just as well. And so if you are discriminating If you are saying that a specific person can't get a job, particular job, because they are of a certain category of race, then, well, that's unjust. And we all accept that to be the case. However, if you interview several people, so let's take the same scenario. Let's say, we're in a job search. And if you interview, say, 10 people, and you're basing the result on competence for the job, okay, you're basing it on competence versus skin color. So you're saying, it doesn't matter. I don't care what color you are. I don't care how tall you are. I don't care what gender you are. It doesn't matter. We're going to base it on competence, meaning whoever is the best for this job, we will give them the job. Well, that's still discrimination, right? Like, it's still discrimination. Think about it. You're saying, you're making your category and you're saying, okay, well, whoever is the most competent gets this job. But we've generally accepted that that's fair. That's okay. It's fair discrimination. It's not unjust discrimination. And so it's just an interesting example. Here's a really cool one that I've always thought about. And I'll just give an example here. So Will Smith, which is an African-American actor. If you don't know, I hope you know him because he's a great actor. But he played in a movie called Pursuit of Happiness, which is, I don't know, maybe definitely in my top 10, maybe even top 5. I don't know. Highly recommend that movie if you haven't seen it. But the character he was portraying was black. Okay. Now, clearly there's discrimination in that process. Clearly, because, it's the same as the example we talked about above, where, if you select or deselect people based on their race, that is discrimination. And, if in most cases that's considered unjust discrimination. However, in this particular case, Will Smith, he's a great actor and he's highly competent. And obviously he kicked ass in that role. But clearly, he wouldn't have gotten that role if he was Caucasian, if he was Asian, or a different race other than African American. They wouldn't have hired a white guy for that role, right? So it's like, it's still discrimination. However, we have generally accepted that that's okay. Why? Well, because we want it to be historically accurate. We want it to add that element to the story. We want to add that, the racial element and the struggle, and we want to pay tribute to the, I can't remember the guy, Chris Gardner, I think it was. We want to pay tribute to him, who was an African American. And so that's just, it's a really interesting thought, because it is discrimination, but it's not unjust discrimination. We've all generally accepted that that's okay. We're okay with that, He should get that job, or maybe not specifically Will Smith, but certainly someone that can historically accurately play that role. Now, on the thing of discrimination, here's an interesting thought, is that romantic relationships, if you have a boyfriend, if you have a girlfriend or whatever, these are the most discriminating thing ever. Think about it. Like, you're choosing one person to give special privileges to. Like, think about it. You're giving one person romance, you're giving one person generally sex, you're giving them children, or you're having children together. You're giving them all these special privileges that no one else gets. So, like, think about it. What is there, 8 billion people on the earth right now? And you're saying, I'm going to give all these privileges to one person. And that is discrimination. Of course it's discrimination, right? However, it's something that we've generally agreed is okay. And we say, okay, no, that's okay, because it's personal freedom. We should get to choose who we have relationships with. And we shouldn't force relationships on people. And we shouldn't force, we can't have a situation where we force everyone to give romance to each other. That's just crazy. That's dystopian future right there. But it doesn't change the fact that it is still a form of discrimination. And here's an interesting one too, on the topic of relationships, specifically on dating. So, like, if you're dating people, there's a lot of women who don't want to date a shorter guy, and that has been backed by studies. Well, sir, I don't know if it was study. I don't want to say study. It was definitely backed by a survey. That generally speaking, women don't want to date someone that is shorter than them. And actually, there was an expert on this on Joe Rogan's podcast. I remember listening, and she said this specific thing as well. That there is some evolutionary purpose for that, obviously, because Back in the day when we were cavemen, you wanted a mate that was bigger, that could actually protect you while you were pregnant and couldn't actually protect yourself. And so there's sort of like that biological drive for that. And of course now we've transcended the need for that. We've transcended the need for the male to protect the female, but that biological drive still exists. But again, to get back to the original thing, there's a lot of women that don't want to date a short guy, and that is discrimination. I mean, think about it. You're saying, okay, if you're in this short guy category, I'm not going to date you, and if you're in this tall guy category, I'll consider you. I mean, that's very much discrimination. However, it's fair discrimination. Why? Well, because people should get to choose who they have relationships with. That gets back to that personal freedom thing. People should get to choose who they have sex with, who they want to have children with, who they give their romance to, and these special privileges. I mean, that's a basic human freedom and a basic human right that trumps that form of discrimination. So it's an interesting thought. That's just one example. So those two examples there, I mean, the job selection and the dating. The interesting thing about that is they both have potential of hurting someone else's feelings, right? And I really want to bring this up because that's something we talk about a lot. Everyone's getting offended all the time, and people saying, "Okay, well, you hurt my feelings." And it's like, well, think about that. Like, if you are a Caucasian actor and you tried to get that role in Pursuit of Happiness, they wouldn't have even looked at you. They would have. I mean, they would have looked at you and seen that you're not African American descent. And they would have said that you can't do that role because they're trying to be historically accurate. And if you were a sensitive person in that interview room, you would have gotten very, very much offended by that. You would have gotten very upset. Your feelings would be hurt and so on. And at the same time, if you, for example, you go on a Tinder date with someone and you show up and you're the short guy, and then this really tall girl comes in and she's like, I'm sorry, but like, I don't really date short guys. And that's probably not going to make him feel good. He's going to feel really bad. It hurts his feelings. And so the point I want to make there is that discrimination, whether it's fair or unfair or just or unjust, it should not be based on if you're offended or if your feelings are hurt. Because these things are rather subjective. I mean, some short dudes would be like, okay, yeah, I get it, because I don't want to date a taller girl. Other short dudes would be like, oh, well, you're discriminating against me, blah, 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 and get their feelings hurt. So it's a subjective thing, but it also means that, just because something offends you, because something hurts your feelings, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily something underneath that's more important. In this example, it's personal freedom. Like it doesn't matter if you're offended because some girl that's taller than you doesn't want to date you. That doesn't matter. What matters is that she should have the personal freedom to say, no, I don't want to date shorter dudes. That's more important than you getting your feelings hurt. And again, the personal freedom thing is big. That trumps everything. Accepted morals and ethics, which of course do change over time as we evolve and we become more sophisticated and so on, sometimes less sophisticated. And also scientific facts. I mean, not even scientific facts, scientific facts, but also historical facts. For example, for Will Smith, we wanted to have that, represent the history. And so, just because your feelings are hurt does not mean it's unjust discrimination. And I have an episode where I talk about where people need to learn to grow some rhino skin, which is called Rhino Skin, and episode 33. And so I'm not going to go too deep into that, but if you're interested, go back and listen to that one as well. So my call to action today is I want you to think about a category you use to discriminate that is actually considered just. Okay, so not unjust discrimination, but just discrimination. And there's countless examples of that. It could be whatever. I mean, dating is a really clear one because dating is is the most discriminatory thing that you can do. So it's very easy if you start actually picking apart, like, okay, I don't want to date anyone taller than me. I don't want to date anyone that eats meat, or I don't want to date anyone that's a picky eater, or I don't want to date anyone that doesn't go to the gym. Whatever it is, if you start picking apart who you actually want to date, you're going to find that you are very, very discriminatory. But guess what? It's not unjust, because we all have that freedom to choose who we date. And so thank you very much for listening, guys. I hope it was a meaningful episode for you. This is up on YouTube if you're interested. I also have a channel on YouTube called actually the Strong Stoic Podcast Clips, which is just little clips of things that I put in there. Blog posts are going up every Monday, episodes out every Tuesday and Thursday. And that's all I want to say today, guys. Cheers. Until next time.